Thanks, everyone. Thanks for your patience. And I'll try not to do the speed version, but I might do some tactical cutting along the way to keep us on schedule. But and thanks to AV for getting this working. Oh, there we go. So as the title suggests, if you can read it, I've made that font a little small. But this is a journey, and that journey is very much underway. And so a lot of the ideas in this, some are more baked than others. And what I'm hoping more than anything is to start conversation around this. So anybody who wants to catch up with me after and talk about what the role of domain-driven design is in data engineering and possibly vice versa, I'm definitely interested in that conversation. So a little bit of prologue. I'm going to do thank yous at the beginning, which is maybe atypical, but if this only accomplishes one thing and it gets you a bunch of interesting source material, then it has had value. And so I want to thank most of all Nick Toon, who is opposite us right now. You made the right choice, but you will want to check out his video. He did a great presentation last year, and it had a huge influence in the way I think about a lot of these problems. He also has an O'Reilly mini book and his blog, which talks a lot about organizational patterns and what he calls design heuristics, is really, really, really important, I think. Also, Paul Rayner's talk last year on modeling team flows, also available online, I would recommend. And Eric Evans' talk from last year that kind of continued into this year about how DDD needs to grow and how we think about bounded context and subdomains. Albert Brandolini, whose event storming workshop, if you haven't taken, you should. You'll see I steal ruthlessly from him in this. And then Ryan Murray from the ThoughtWorks digital platform strategy team, who a lot of his thinking has influenced the way I think about platform. And I highly recommend the sort of executive summary he does that's online that I'll reference at the end. And finally, 3 books, and then I'll move on to actual content. And that's Principles of Product Development Flow by Donald Reinertsen. Sorry, I always pronounce his name wrong. Good Strategy, Bad Strategy by Richard Rumelt. And, of course, Eric's book, because, that's why we're here. So I seem to be coming and going. I am the director of engineering. Yep. No, that's fine. You know the term schlemiel and schlemazel? You know this? So the schlemiel is someone who dumps their soup. The schlemazel is the person on whom the soup is dumped. So today, I am the schlemazel.
Is your cell phone far away from me? Where is your cell phone? Where you keep this?
Okay, I will be delicate. All right. I will move slowly. Oh, very slowly. Okay, so Director of Engineering, Hatch Data. I'll leave it at that for now. When I signed up for this, I was a senior software engineer at New Relic. And prior to that, a consultant at ThoughtWorks. And this talk draws on sort of 2.5 of those, a little bit ThoughtWorks and with a focus on the other 2 primarily. So I'll do a rapid run through what DDD is to me, because I think the diversity of content at this conference is reflective of what I think of as a really broad and evolving discipline. And so we'll see everything from rapid discovery with sticky notes and storytelling and tactical patterns and prototyping approaches. And this is all important, and I just want to put some boundaries on it. So the way I think about this is creating a mental model that is hopefully shared, building software in the image of that model, and then reality forcing us to deviate from that model and help us to understand the model better as well as understand the systems themselves, and then repeat. And this is a bit of a tap dance as the constraints of the organization as the system make themselves manifest. And whether you're doing event storming or process modeling or whiteboarding or UML or whatever your flavor is, this is sort of an inevitability. And if you don't agree with that basic assumption, we can battle it out later. So why do we do this? It's to make our systems comprehensible and therefore easier to maintain and extend, rationally factored, which is obviously related to that topic, but some of the highest value is achieved having a domain focus not just on the code, but even more so on organizational structure and capability structure, and how do you factor your capabilities to optimize for whatever it is you're optimizing for, and that's a big question. And I've heard this articulated less frequently, but there's the idea that having a domain focus actually makes the capabilities you design more useful. And I won't go deep into that. There are other conversations about that to be had, but it is something I fervently believe. And so it's about optimizing our ability to create value at the end of the day, not kind of a well-duh statement, but I think important to say. Data engineering is probably even murkier subject, if that's possible. And so audience participation moment, throw out a couple of words very briefly that you associate with data engineering. Pain. Did somebody say pain? Streaming. ETL. There's the pain. Analytics, great. Okay. A lot of things. Actually, we were more focused than I expected. I thought we were going to get Kafka like 5 times. And so for me, the way I think about this is, yes, analytics. That's kind of fundamental. That analytics specifically on very large data sets, whether at rest or in transit, ingest of data at very high rate, and obviously storage of those. And there's this interesting aspect of this where for a long time we've been able to lean heavily on the fact that hardware is getting bigger, faster, drives are getting faster. That's not really true in this world anymore. So the result is lots of data and wide concurrent query patterns. And my guess is that will never change. I don't think the scale at which we're storing data and streaming data is faster than our drives will ever be able to store data. So I think the wide concurrency patterns are here to stay. Then the final thing I reference is this idea of transformation, decoration, whatever we want to call it. That's maybe on the border, but pretty much every application, particularly those streaming ones, have the pattern of query the data, read the data, transform the data, republish or store the data. That's pretty standard issue. And what this results in is rather large amounts of hardware, and whether those are virtualized or physical, they need to be managed. Highly distributed concurrent systems on levels we haven't seen today, and that creates a need for horizontal scale. And it's interesting because horizontal scale isn't just a need for storing and streaming more data. It's actually necessary for when the character of that data changes. For example, you have new indexes you have to worry about. The shape changes, the cardinality changes. All these things actually have ramifications on your architecture. And so being able to be elastic is really important because you may have to blow out to a huge amount of hardware and then come back to a reasonable and affordable size. And then finally, you hear the term data locality all the time, and that's sort of a byproduct of that wide query pattern, that we have to worry about data that's used together is stored together, at least for some period of time, and that where the data is, you don't bring it to the code, you send the code to the data. Pretty much an aphorism in data engineering at this point. But that creates a really interesting set of constraints that's different than a lot of other disciplines. So now we begin sort of the storytelling aspect of this, and which I will make slightly more efficient. Short story, was exposed to domain-driven design at ThoughtWorks, where I was a consultant focusing on verticals largely, so consumer retail, did work with energy optimization, oil field management, telecoms, all these things. And so it became a mechanism for me, kind of in a self-directed kind of way, to absorb domains very quickly and be able to message them in a meaningful way, although I was experimenting every step of the way. And sometimes people would say, wow, that's amazing. And other times they'd say, aren't I paying you to code? Go code. But it's something that helped me understand, so I've kept it as a practice. It's been an important practice to me, Then when I left ThoughtWorks, because consulting is hard and the road is hard, I went to New Relic in Portland. And New Relic had the impact of changing the way I thought about data in a profound way. And I'll never forget when I was at my job interview. And they said, we think you belong on the NRDB team, which is the team that runs the event store. And they said, we stream more data than Twitter. And I was like, and you think I belong on that team? Okay. So data, what was big data became really big data. And what New Relic's specialization was, and continues to be, is engineers who write highly performant parallel code, who are really good at optimizing storage, who are really good at squeezing every last drop out of CPU, but DDD was not a thing at all. People looked at me real funny when I brought it up. But what was interesting is that the high rate of ingest, query, and storage was climbing faster and faster and continues to be, and a lot of organizations are seeing this. And there was a lot of conversation around not just how to scale the software, which people were actually quite good at, but how to scale the organization and how it interacted with the software, which was acknowledged to be a much harder problem, and that the conventional tool set didn't address. So, there was, in my mind, logic to why I thought DDD might be the right solution to it. And it was those same three things that I mentioned before, that we wanted software that was comprehensible, systems that were comprehensible, rationally factored, and more likely to be usable in serendipitous ways. I want to call out the first one in particular, because we think of data engineering as a very technical exercise. But if you think about the number of different concerns involved in running these systems and building these systems, there's cluster management and configuration, there's data ingestion, there's query design and optimization, there's data retention and origination and compaction and hardware management and complex custom monitoring. And there are a lot of contexts here. And any single one of those at scale could have its own team. So having a way to talk about that is really, really important. The question was this the situation I was in? Well, I didn't think so. And the reason I didn't think so is because I think this metaphor is actually, it's kind of a false metaphor. Because I don't think DDD is a hammer, and I don't think data engineering is a nail. I think they're both highly multidisciplinary practices. So I think the situation is a bit more like this. There's a really messy shed, and there's a lot of great tools in it, but it's real hard to find the right one for a given situation, particularly in certain types of problem spaces. So I had to ask myself the question, is there a set of tools that I can use to apply to this problem? And I'm thinking, by the way, I'm going off script for a second, but I was a senior software engineer. I became technical product manager. I'm also really, really nosy. So this wasn't my job, but I'm doing a lot of this and saying, hey, what about this? Hey, what about this? And you'll see how I was punished. So the question became cataloging those tools. And so the problems were a wide range, is that even legible? A wide range, I can't even read it. A wide range of independent capabilities with fuzzy boundaries. Well, that's kind of a sweet spot. That's subdomain boundaries and distilled bounded contexts and all that stuff we talk about a lot. Complex workflows across capability boundaries. Well, event storming is actually really nice for that sort of thing. There's ambiguous, redundant, and overloaded terminology. Well, I think we probably mostly know what that is. That's ubiquitous language set in context boundaries. Then there's scale as a first order concern. And this had me scratching my head a little bit. I didn't know how to think about this in terms of making it so multiple people can work on the problem. Similarly, coupled ingest and query, which may seem like a technical detail, but it's so intrinsic to the problem space. It's such a deep constraint that it's hard to just pretend it doesn't exist for periods of time. And then a highly technical, and I mean software technical problem space that has software at its core. And the interesting complexity that creates that I'll talk about in a little bit. So I had those three things where I'm like, what do I do with these? Well, what do you do when you don't know what to do? You experiment. So I advocated, despite all the uncertainties I had, because I have a fair bit of bluster in me. I can convince people to let me do stuff. And I picked out a selection of tools, and I got to work. So I lobbied to moderate some sessions with my team. And that offer was hesitantly, guardedly accepted. And I'm not even sure why, possibly the strength of conviction, which is, by the way, a terrible heuristic for knowing if somebody's right. Like scientifically speaking, it is a terrible heuristic, but it works. So I'm going to talk about a couple of those exercises, some of which are kind of standard issues, and I won't talk about those in depth, and then some of which kind of were fit for purpose invented. And my assertion is that some of those may have applications beyond what I used them for. So phase one was the apply what little you know phase. That was, I spun up some quick educational systems. What is sessions? What is DDD? Why do we do it? What are the outcomes that we're after? And then a couple of chaotic exploration sessions, just like get it all out, kind of like how do we see the current state of the world and what would we like the future state to be? And with a couple of notable exceptions, the team was actually quite enamored with where we got. And I made some real rookie mistakes that I could see Alberto in the background like shaking his head. And we had some struggles seeing the forest for the trees sometimes, but we actually had some convergence on sort of mental model. And despite that forest for the trees problem really came back to bite us in some ways. And it was hard to think about things like query experience from a customer perspective and decouple it from the query functions in which they're implemented because of how tightly coupled those things are in an environment like this. And probably more importantly, to steal from Nick Toon, he talks about socio-technical environments. We had a complex socio-technical environment, as you do, and we didn't have all the stakeholders we needed to make this now more converged mental model actionable. We'd try to move with it, and people would be like, what's that? And so that quickly became a constraint. Then this happened. This is a year ago, maybe not today, but pretty close. I went to last year's session and saw Nick's presentation and Paul's presentation. And this design heuristics idea gave me the most food for thought. What I saw is someone taking the core principles and outcomes that DDD is after and inventing new models of application. And I figured, I probably have to do that. So reorg. Someone said yesterday, the big companies are just always reorging. Well, I came back and we reorged. So this was the situation before. We were big teams, and sort of two and a half pizza teams, but doing a sort of DevOps kind of approach to it. And a lot of cooks in every kitchen, a ton of responsibilities, both operational and development per team. We were really thrashing in some ways. And so the reorg happened, which of course usually creates that, at least for a little while. No matter how wise the reorg is, you don't know whether you're coming or going. But as things settled, some of those difficulties were alleviated. And because the teams were smaller, we had fewer cooks in the kitchen. We had more common understanding within the teams. We had fewer responsibilities per team, and so your mission was a little clearer. On the other hand, we owned a lot of roadmaps where we didn't own the operations to the thing. We owned a lot of operations where we didn't own the roadmap. When we owned both, we were coupled to something where we owned neither. There was still, so what we did again, Nick, whose talk you're missing right now, we replace local complexity with global complexity. Team management was much more sane. Cross-team management was still really complex. I don't know if it was more complex, but it was complex. And so it was acknowledged that more needed to be done. And so this is when the real experimentation began. And we knew we needed a solution. We didn't know what it was. The first reorganization didn't work, or didn't work well enough, or hadn't worked yet. It wasn't entirely clear. But I started meddling again, like I do, and I put my hand in the air. And we had this summit. And I'm not going to tell you about all of it again, because there was a lot to it. But I'll tell you about a couple of those exercises that were born for it. The first one we called the dimensions exercise. And again, inspired by Nick and Alberto's work. Nick had offered some heuristics for thinking about how to divide capabilities. There's sort of the obvious ones. What do they do? Like security or ingest, or that's one heuristic one can use. But there are a lot of them. And the larger message to me was that you decide what things you care about most and figure out which ones are in tension and try to keep them from interfering with each other is sort of the broad heuristic. And so we did this. We took pairs of what we call dimensions. They're kind of ilities or cross-functional requirements or whatever you want to call them. And we put them each on an axis. And then we took our capabilities, our services, we didn't go down to the component level, but we kind of put them on a matrix. It's sort of like, what do you call it? Like Gartner's things or something like that. And so my favorite example is, because it's kind of a well-known example, is availability versus consistency. That'd be a fairly obvious one. Or need for stability versus expected rate of change. There's another thing that's often kind of clashing because some people want things to be moving really fast. Other people want things to never go down. So those things are often in tension. So you do that with one set, and then you add another couple of attributes. And you can even reuse the same one on one axis because it's sometimes interesting to see how it maps against a different dimension. And since n-dimensional whiteboards don't exist yet, or sticky notes, we have to sort of use color as our third dimension. And then just keep repeating this exercise until you've, whatever your problem space is you're trying to work out. And then finally, this is a kind of old event storming approach, the hotspots, the things that are either contentious, people have very different perspectives on, people are like playing tug of war over stickies to try to get them in different places. Those become park it, but call it out, because we're going to have to talk more about that later. So you end up with a lot of those, particularly in that upper right corner. The upper right corner of just about anything, and also particularly something where the same capability shows up in the upper right corner a whole bunch of times, that's reflective of a hotspot. And that's probably where you want to focus the rest of your summit, because that's going to be a big deal. So this yielded some fruit. There was general agreement on hotspots, and we made explicit some things that had been sort of sub rosa. One lesson learned on this exercise, and this is a more general note, that particularly in the Pacific Northwest, convergence and politeness, they look very similar. And so finding ways to coax out conflict is actually a real moderation skill that I have some work to do. Office in Pacific Northwest. So, second exercise we did was, who is my customer? We started with actually those same capabilities. This was at the service level. This was a sort of low-level view of things. And we grouped them by teams. And then we layered on who were the customers, and that's internal customers. Like because we were a platform team, what products, what other capability teams were reliant on this set of services. And then paying particular attention to where the user touch points are, the end users, calling those out separately. And then again, relying on the old hotspot indicators to see where there are battles breaking out, or where there are really big clusters. And I was particularly interested in where there are both a lot of internal dependencies and a lot of external dependencies, because my theory was that you're going to have a lot of the servant of two masters problems in those areas, and a kind of easy example is if I have a service that I'm giving to a end user that has an SLA of half a millisecond response time, and then somebody builds a product on top of that also has a half a millisecond response time, my SLOs are suddenly going to change. And changing SLOs is not free, despite the fact that it's easy to write something different. In an Excel spreadsheet, generally that involves resources and thoughtfulness. And so those are the spots where there had to be some sort of reconciliation of which master was being served. And the third and final exercise I'm going to talk about in this little cluster is the initiatives and boundaries exercise. And this is about as simple as you can get. On one side was the major initiatives, the major company initiatives. On the top was all the different teams. And there's a talk out of ThoughtWorks where James Lewis talks about the fact that when you cross team boundaries, you often see an order of magnitude increase in delivery time. I'm not sure whether order of magnitude is really true, but certainly we've all seen friction at team boundaries. So the contention was that if we had major initiatives that required a lot of teams and they were heavily involved, we were going to have a complex project management problem. And we had to choose either make the teams reflect the initiative, make the initiatives reflect the team, which would be a little weird, or no, we were going to have to wrestle with this project management problem. And we did see a couple of lines of like red, which was indicated highly involved activity on the part of the team. And then, again, with the hotspots. So none of these were exactly standard DDD exercises, but a lot of them were slight tweaks on particularly event storming type exercises. So what was the outcome of this? Honestly, I don't know. About the middle of the session, I got this call that drew me away. I was there for the next few weeks. But definitely the conversation had changed. It was in the process of changing. The DDD champion there is gone, and I don't think I had an error. So how much of that opinion will be reflected going forward, I can't say. But I think it produced some value. Although no longer a consultant, I have a little of that consultant's view, like, well, hope it worked. Now I have an entirely new set of problems, a whole lot more leverage on a much smaller organization, and it's really hard to find the time. So I'm going to very quickly say what I'm intending to do. Some of this I've started doing, some of this I haven't. Last year I became really enamored with event storming process modeling. And if you've taken Alberto's class, he probably walked you through this. And the reason I'm going to do a lot more of this, I've done a little and I'm going to do a lot more going forward, is it has this sort of CQRS-like opinion of the world with separate read and write models. And that matches the high-volume data engineering world really, really well because you're forced into separate ingest and query pathways most of the time. And so my contention is that having that mental model is going to be really useful. And maybe I'll do a session next year to tell you whether it was Rocket or Hindenburg. Hard to say. The second one, and this is not well thought out yet, but there's something about making constraints a first order concept in your model. And I'm sure there are ways to do this, but this isn't something like even the boundaries are in and of themselves constraints, but even within those boundaries there are constraints that can separate a really pretty but highly academic model from something that's going to be useful. And the set of constraints in data engineering, particularly some of the things I talked about earlier about the relationship between ingest and query and things like that, they really limit some of the options you have in front of you. And making that more clear up front is something that I really want to experiment with because I'm not sure today how to do it. So conclusions from all this, based on kind of my inception at ThoughtWorks and the idea of DDD, and then my experimentation at New Relic in an enterprise context, my new experimentation at Hatch in a startup context. There's some learnings I've sort of taken away from all this. Some of them are semi-orthogonal to all this. Some of them are directly related. But yesterday in Eric's talk, he talked about all these new sort of qualities of bounded context. And what I'd really love to see, and hopefully you won't just say you do it, is something like Martin Fowler's refactoring catalog or the Portland pattern repository that Kent Beck and Ward Cunningham created that helps not just generic contexts, generic domains, but also the qualities that you might see in more specific contexts. And so a couple of those that I've been playing around with is this idea of a novel supporting domain. And what I mean by that is something where it's not obvious. It's not what you do, and yet it might be core, and that fuzzy definition of whether something is core or not. And so when you're focusing on core domain, oops, there we go again. When you're focusing on your core domain, and I have a lot of notes in my new rel, like I have notebooks full, I write a lot, and it said, what is our core domain? What is our core domain? What is our core domain? And no one could answer that question. Mostly they said, what's a domain? But so you can follow the money. That's certainly indicative of something that could be a core domain. You can talk about what your competitive advantage is, or you can talk about what we do. We are in observability. We are in energy use management. But all of those are pretty rough heuristics. And I thought about an organization a lot like Netflix, who, if you think about what they do, they're a middleman for content that's all available somewhere else. And what they do, what they focus on, or focused on, I should say, they're not that anymore, to be honest. They focused on becoming one of the world's best cloud delivery companies, which is a kind of an odd choice if you think about it in those terms. And I don't know that they do DDD thinking around this, but they had an instinctive reaction, and they went to cloud delivery, and they didn't become a cloud delivery company. They just open sourced all that stuff and let us trip over it. But I assert there are certain situations where there's a high barrier to entry in a dynamic technology space that it can be the focus of your company, particularly in the era of disruptors, where the means by which something is delivered is every bit as important as the thing you're delivering itself, because you have the ability to pivot with the marketplace. And data engineering is an interesting one because it's sort of on the cusp of this. Like 12 years ago, HDFS became widely available, and people built a lot of very complex systems on top of it. And their competitive advantage was their expertise in those systems they had built. But then Spark became available, and Storm, and Kafka, and Flink, and a whole bunch of frameworks. And so 5 years ago, a company in a vertical like medical or entertainment might be able to focus on large-scale data processing and have that the central investment in their business and compete on that merit. 5 years from now, I would argue, forget about it. That stuff's commodified. It's off the shelf. So when you're thinking about the novel, quote, supporting domain, is it something you can buy? This isn't one of them. Is it something that has a pre-existing set of practices and language? It's probably not one of them. On the other hand, is it something that can enable you to shift strategy really quickly in the way, what and how you deliver? Is it something that is somewhat unique and rare, which is kind of the opposite of commodified, I suppose? Possibly it has this characteristic. And then, because I'm almost out of time, I'm going to talk about one more context, and that is the mechanics context. So we've all been in organizations that they think of IT as a cost center, and yet they're pushing more and more responsibility onto it, and so they're underinvesting in some really core capabilities. When they are investing, it's at the product manager's behest, user-facing things. And because product managers have an advantage, they're talking about user value, they're talking about dollars. And those of us who are advocating for platform are talking about risk, and we're talking about technical debt. That's a really hard thing to debate. So there's this context that's going to have this quality. And if you don't invest enough, you're going to end up with a car that doesn't have a hood, which you won't care about until something goes wrong. If you overinvest, you're going to end up with a car that doesn't run, but has a gold-plated hood. And so the trick, I think, of these contexts is sort of attaching the metrics to user value, even though that's a difficult exercise, and tracking yourself to whatever those major strategic outcomes are. How do you do that? Again, I'll let you know next time. It's a hard problem. And I won't talk about that one or that one, but this refers to, like, we're building software, we're using software to build software, we're having a real hard time telling where our implementation details separates, and we're getting these things just cross-pollinated left, right, and center. And I'll say, and I'll leave it at this, being your own domain expert is a very mixed blessing. It sounds like a great idea, and at New Relic and to some degree at Hatch Data, I've seen what can happen. It's sort of what they say about lawyers. A lawyer who represents him or herself as a fool for a client, the old aphorism. I think this is a similar issue where having some distance can be useful, and so that's another struggle. And with that, I almost made it on time. These will be available for download, and so I have a rather large index of references, most of which I mentioned, all of which I mentioned. And I'm going to call that the end. Thank you very much.